Hey everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus, but you can call me Noctis. Today we're doing another speed paint that serves quite a few roles here. The first is that this is intended to be the March print for the print club that I run, as I felt the idea would be fun to draw and rather fitting for the moment. The second role, and the one we will discuss for most of this video, is that I simply felt compelled to depict it, in a sense, after waking from a dream. So after quite a bit of time, this would fall into my series of drawing dreams and nightmares. So to be honest, I've not really drawn a nightmare yet, so that may be the next instalment of this series. I mean, dreams are one of those things that commonly inspire me with my art anyway. I dream often, and usually wake up with a lot of details from the dream, or I'm able to recall events of the dream rather well. I may forget them as the day goes on, and some are vivid that I will remember them days later. Usually I will still note them down if I think that they could be good inspiration though. Now, regardless of this drawing was vivid enough that I had very clear images of the dream, and a lot of detail from what happened. It was something I knew that I would be drawing the moment that I woke up too, so let's turn our attention to this then, shall we? The starting point, of course, was the dream itself. It gave me everything to this drawing, so allow me some time to walk you through it as well, shall we? See, the dream began on one of the local train station's platforms. For context, this particular station is an older style, and it is usually only moderately busy. I say moderately as it isn't often packed, yet it has the potential to be around rush hour maybe, and it isn't really ever empty or silent either. There's always someone mulling around. In all fairness, it is a typical train station that could be found in so many places. Pardon the pun here, but we are kind of getting off track though. The point here is that the dream began at the station, the train set to approach soon, with very few people around for the day. I would like to say that there were maybe 1 or 2 people around, so it was quieter than usual but not in an off-putting manner. The train arrived as normal, and it started out rather ordinary. Reflecting on it, it may have been hard to call it a dream, as it mirrored simply getting on the train. In this case, it only got more unusual when on the train itself and the further along in the journey. Even the journey was fairly ordinary at the beginning. The longer the journey was, the more the environment outside began to simply vanish and change. The usual scenery of houses gave way to the expected fields along most routes, yet those too began to fade away over time, rather than going back into the next housing or city area. The clouds got lower, the sky more vibrant. It wasn't so quick that it was really too noticeable in the beginning, maybe just something like a mist around the train before any other assumption. There wasn't really a sense of concern about it either. I do want to stress that too. None of this dream ever really felt that I should have been concerned by it, and everything was simply calm and accepted, as strange as that may sound. You see, the next shift of the dream, after the environment outside had begun to change, had then been the train itself. When I first got on, I don't recall if there were people there, or if there was anybody around me or not. If there was, it didn't feel important or noteworthy, and I wasn't really caring much for those details. I was going somewhere, not looking at that. Yet, when outside was nothing but an ever-expanding blue abyss and clouds, there were certainly passengers around me, and some mirrored people I know, or people that I once knew. And again, I didn't really know when this change took place. I just know that it did at some point between the environment vanishing and them appearing. Now, there was one catch to this entire thing though. The people weren't solid. I mean, they were there, but not entirely, and some were more transparent than others. I ended up drawing them as shadows, since truly that is what the majority of them were. If I had to explain it simply, I would call them impressions of people I know that weren't entirely untruly there, but they were also there at the same time. Some of them I knew more than others, could likely name if I needed to, or tell you how I knew them. Yet there was a majority that I didn't know, and somehow was aware that they were strangers compared to the others. It was after this that the final shift of the dream occurred. The train cart began to gradually become overgrown, even though the plants came from nowhere. Bushes appeared and grew over most areas that they could claim, and vines began to fall and loop between surfaces that would hold them there. From that moment, it continued for a while, yet I found that I woke up before we reached any sort of destination, and there wasn't any kind of interaction either with anything or anyone that was on the train. I simply sat and watched as things changed and shifted without any true concern or feeling over the situation. It was actually only when I started telling people about this dream that it started to sound unusual or concerning. At that moment in time, and even for a bit after I woke up, it was calm. It made sense. Now, I do want to specify one thing when it came to translating this into a drawing. The first is that I wasn't trying to draw myself or to capture too much likeness of myself. I often feel strange doing that, so it is unusual that I would strictly do it to a portrait. The closest thing that I have is a character I made in high school who shared traits of me at the time in a generalised manner, and a few other times that I have given characters things from myself. I would say that the closest otherwise was in the Drawing Dreams and Nightmares series, where I saw someone who looked like me, but even then was off in a few manners. In this instance, drawing myself wouldn't fit either, so I ended up going with a very generalised person that I tend to draw and alter a lot as I need to. But I will likely elaborate on that a little bit later when I really get into the details and the other matters of the drawing. I just kind of felt that it was something I should note quite early on. Saying that, let's look at how this drawing then physically came to be. Sketching for this was a fair bit of a challenge. I wasn't sure what perspective I wanted to do or what content to include. The platform would have been boring as a subject, the start of the dream before anything ever happened. The start of the train could have been an option too, yet I felt that it would best capture the dream if it was somewhere between the second and third change, and that was mainly so I could highlight the elements that were unusual about this train ride, and kind of really get into the atmosphere of the dream. The real doubt had been how much growth that I would end up including. When it began, there were one or two sprouts, and maybe a few leaves without much sense about how they got there. I could have done that, and kept it fairly tame, or gone with more closer to the choice that I made, and gone with it in the later stage, where it almost looked as if the carriage had been left for a few years, just abandoned and overgrown. The only issue I found about the left for years theory was that the outside of the train was physically fine, but I am kind of getting distracted here. It is fairly obvious which route won. I chose this because I enjoy drawing things overgrown, and I find it more visually appealing than the other routes available. But in saying that, I also felt that it said more about the dream overall than if I'd kept it to an earlier point. There wasn't much appeal to the earliest point, so, in the end, I believe that I drew one of the few moments before I woke up. The plants at that point had stopped growing, and we were still en route to the destination, since outside hadn't changed much either. I just had to work out how to draw that. It was a fairly small part of the drawing, being only in the windows, so it wasn't too central in the sketch. I sort of just left it to work out later, and I focused more on making the internal of the train make sense, since I was also having a bit of a struggle getting everything to be coherent, whilst also adding in the right details from the dream. Most of these details will be mentioned later, yet for now I could then move into the flat colours, and this was probably a bit easier than I would normally say that they were. For starters, I had a good grasp of what impression I would be working towards, and in the same breath, knew what the general central colour of the palette would be based around. I usually gravitate towards purple because I like the colour. This time I have a bit of a stronger defence though. This dream to me is a purple dream. As strange as that sounds now that I'm saying it. The train should have been grey, yet I remembered it with a purple hue, and it made it more interesting as an image overall, with a subtle shift towards the unnatural events of the dream. It sat well with the green and the blue in the palette as well, and really, I didn't see much benefit of changing it. A natural palette would have been unusual in this instance, as the dream was about strange events unfolding, and there wasn't a normal palette of the dream. By this, I don't remember it in a normal palette that you would come to expect. Pushing this drawing to normality would have needed more explaining. I would have had to defend the choice that bit more. I could have maybe pushed it towards another colour, maybe pink or yellow or something. Yet the purple worked well with all of these, and I could sort of tie in the other elements in some ways. Areas of the purple look closer to pink, and I do later tie in yellow with lighting and shadows in the image and such. Red palettes were then a bit too sinister in this instance, or it pushed the feeling of the image in the wrong direction, so it simply didn't sit right. It's why, as much as I use purple, I let myself do it again this time, and I really didn't lose anything by it. Beyond all of this, the flat colours then took me quite some time to do. This drawing as a whole took me a bit longer than normal, this script and video being a bit closer to my upload time than I would typically like, as I usually have these handled quite a bit ahead of time. Yet the flats were then part of where I noticed this. I don't really have a good reason either for why this one took me so much longer. They simply took longer than I expected, and I wasn't sure what was happening with it. Especially considering that this video isn't a kind of a whole lot longer than I tend to make them. It just took me a fair bit of time to get things right, and a few tries to just ensure that it was correct. I then, near the end of the flat colours, had an issue with the person. This is where we will be going into the details of the drawing, starting naturally with the focal point of the figure. See, their flat colours were giving me issues and trouble, just like when I was sketching them. In the dream, this was myself. But I wasn't trying to draw myself as it didn't fit and didn't look correct. I tried them with key aspects of my appearance, brown hair, eyes, mainly to keep some sort of thread to it. Yet that in its entirety didn't look right. The eyes were fine, but the hair just wasn't really working. It's when I abandoned the idea of keeping a thread to me in this drawing. I was already drawing from the dream, so I could have some sort of creative liberty with it. I kind of began to view it as a character. Specifically, my character from high school. Yet allowed myself to make any changes that I wished. It wasn't them, but they were kind of a base for it all, if that makes sense. I may also be talking in circles again. In the end though, I settled on this palette for them. The hair was also inspired after how I once dyed my hair. A sort of tint really more than a full dye, since I wasn't really allowed to bleach my hair at that point. It was something, certainly. The colour only appeared under certain lights, but I quite enjoyed it either way, since it later let me try all sorts of colours. Yet it is then memorable as the first time that I tried it. In this case, it was the only palette that really felt right out of everything that I tried so far, so it was the one that ended up staying. Though, looking at the person as a whole, they were the focal point of the drawing in a sense. I mean, I was focused a lot on capturing the environment that they exist within, and kind of telling the story in that manner. The person was secondary in that sense. Yet when it comes to looking at the image, they are also kind of framed by everything around them, and are undeniably what you see first. In saying this, I still wanted them to blend into everything else around them, and to not stand out too much when all is said and all is done. I did this, again, via their palette by tying it in purple and blue. And also kind of with their outfit and hair. But I also feel like I accomplished it by setting them slightly to the side when perspective is taken into the account. They still grab the eye, draw attention rather well, yet not in a way that will distract from everything else around them. In the end, they aren't really too detailed either and sit rather nicely with everything around them. All in all, there isn't too much to really say about them in isolation either, which, ironically, was part of my intent with this drawing. I had a lot more fun working on other areas of this one, hence why shading the person is the last thing that I did for this work. And I also have more to say with the choices made elsewhere, as that is what created the environment, the feeling, and everything that I was really going for. So let's start looking at the next detail then, shall we? This would naturally be the shades, the impressions, or the ghosts. Whatever it is that people want to call them, as I have no real clue how to identify them myself. I just know that at some point, all of the other passengers were these sort of shadowy beings that were merely existing around in the carriage and acting as other passengers. There were most that I remember nothing about, just that there were more in the dream than I could reasonably draw in this single scene. Yet the unusual thing about this was that a few of them looked like people I could name, and they stood out in the crowds for it. In all of this, there was also a minuscule amount that I felt as if I knew them, or that I had at the very least seen them before, but I didn't know a name or something about them. Of everything in the dream, this was the part that was most off-putting after I woke up, and kind of when I started explaining it to people. Again, in the moment it was fine, and I barely thought twice about it. Yet, after waking up and explaining this to others whilst drawing this image, and kind of explaining why I was doing this, it was the thing that got the most concern or the most reaction out of people first. The environment going to nothing? Yeah, dreams are pretty odd. Again, the overplants from nowhere. I myself have had stranger dreams than that, so none really bat an eye to it. I think the reaction is often because I could recognise some of the shadows in all of it. One of them was one of my old neighbours, another was someone from school. Yet there were some that I could tell apart via defining traits, like one that looked as if they were wearing a flat cap, and another in a long coat. When drawing this, I knew that these would be a key part of it. If I left them out, it wouldn't be this dream, but instead read more as someone sat in an abandoned train carriage, when that wasn't really the narrative that I was going for. I'll save that for some other day. The shades would add questions, interest where it would otherwise feel rather direct. I knew that they'd be hard to draw, but I would need it to get it right and to make this drawing feel finished. The hardest part with these figures is that, in the dream, they weren't solid but all in different ways. Those closest to me were the most solid, simply a walking shadow as a comparison. They lacked colour, and they were covered in shade and shadow, yet they had facial features or key details, such as the ones that I included here in the reference. These were the most lifelike to people. One pair is something that stood out, so I referred to it in the drawing, a woman and a child where I could make out a bow in the child's hair. They were wearing some simple dresses, the child that is, and the woman had a jacket over what they were wearing. Another near to me was the one with a flat cap that I didn't draw in this image, yet remained memorable all the same. Now, beyond these were the others that were a bit further away. They were a little more wispy, as if they were made from shadows rather than cast in shadows or a walking shadow. They were also less stable at the edges, and, overall, lacked more visible details to their figure. For an example of these, there was one whose only trait was that they had some sort of bag with them due to the shape of the shadows. But there weren't too many of these that I could recognise or recall upon waking up. I didn't draw these since they were too far to really include in the image, and I couldn't put the perspective in to make it make sense. and I also didn't know how I would go about it, especially when I remembered so little about them all. The closest still had the details in the shadows as if they were picked out by whatever light was in the dream, yet the vast majority of them didn't. When drawing them, I kind of kept to a charcoal brush in Clip Studio, since I knew that I wasn't going to kind of get that feeling with a solid colour, and this brush is very much a broken texture. Working into it, I used the design pencil, since I knew that it too could kind of be rather fluffy and soft if used in the right way, and at a lower opacity. I wouldn't really have the issue of them being too solid in this case, and I could work into them with elements of light rather than shadow if I needed to. I did end up doing this as well, mainly just so I could pick out some key details, like the bow in the jacket, and also so they looked more integrated into the image, as they were still part of the environment and rather key to it as well. I then found that I really liked how it came out. I wasn't the most certain going into it about how this would all end up. I expected an argument with it, and thought that I would otherwise be struggling to get it right and would have to do it over and over 1,000 times. Yet, on the first try, it worked out really well, and kind of worked out in my favour, and I didn't even need to retry them. Moving on then, we have about 3 details left, and all of them are rather straightforward or direct with working on them, so we should be able to cover both before the end arrives here. The first of these 2 was outside the environment. This was left to the very end, as I had no clue how to portray what I recall. I also wasn't sure what I could even remember about the exterior, since it wasn't exactly a focal point of the image, and I didn't take much notice of it after the original shift. I also wasn't sure if I wanted to portray this shift, or put it earlier in the dream, or kind of just commit to it being at the end where the shift had already occurred. I kind of settled on going with the last option, doing it when it had already changed and had kind of settled in its change. This meant that it was a blue abyss, expanding for forever with no end in sight as there wasn't anything outside. I couldn't even see the tracks that we had been following, so I had no clue where we were or where we would be going. I just knew that the blue went on for as far as the eye could see. Not a tree or a sign or a house in sight, as we just kind of went along without issue. The only disturbance was the clouds. There were still groups of them in the sky, though you had to kind of peer out of the window for them and to truly see them. I took a bit of creative liberty in the end. I made the base of the window filled with the clouds for the interest, and to still include them since I wasn't otherwise sure how to go about their presence. And the plain blue felt that it was missing something, or just that it was part of the image that I forgot to shade and completely overlooked and missed, which wasn't what I was going for. It might have been how it felt, but it wasn't what I wanted for the drawing. And I found that I had this issue with quite a few sections, feeling like something was missing, I mean. Yet it was especially present with the window, which didn't fit right. Yes, the clouds were simple and minimal compared to everything else, yet it really helped bring it all together in a way that I feel like it was meant to be. But moving swiftly on to detail 2, the overgrowth. The intent with this one was just to let it go wild, while still trying to focus on the layering and to have it feel like it was interacting with the environment, and that it was part of it all. For an example of this, the foreground would be growing the most, since it was in the aisle of the train and it kind of had the most open space to grow larger. More vines and hanging plants would fall from the overhead storage, so it made sense to include those there, with a few vines also starting to wrap around the poles. These poles being the ones that people would kind of hold on to during busier hours or if they had to stand. The seats would also then have had some on it, but it wasn't nearly as badly hit. My number 1 rule for the foliage this time was that there would be no flowers involved. There weren't any in the dream, and adding them would really have distracted, or it would have been another layer of detail to consider without serving a point. Besides, I didn't want it to tilt the feeling of the image with the flowers or colours of them that I may have wanted to use. There weren't any in the dream, simply bushes alone and greenery. and I woke up before any may have had the chance to grow if they were going to show up. I actually really enjoyed these areas too. Yes, they may have been a little tedious to shade at the end, but I really liked how they turned out with the different layers of greenery and the natural impressions that it adds to everything around it, whilst it still seems to be a little bit out of place and out of the ordinary. They belong, and they are rather well established. Yet they're still not meant to be there, no matter how they hang and drape off what is around them. They were fun, something I also didn't need to think about too much. And I kind of find that what I felt right with this drawing usually worked out quite well, and this was a section that just kept feeling right. So then, briefly here, the final detail I added was actually off camera. I finished recording it and kind of felt that I was done with drawing for the day, but it still didn't feel complete. So I kind of did my usual and I added my little dots to it all as little sparkles, and I finished it off with the usual glowy bits that I just personally enjoy, which really made it feel right and brought it all together. It also added that needed interest overall. It didn't feel finished without them, and this is a little trick that often works wonders for what I end up doing, and I am really glad that I still included them. Overall though, this drawing worked out as I wanted it to. It gave the right impression, and it had enough of the unusual events present that people could look at it and see the story, or potentially work out what they wanted the story to be and apply it as needed. I loved how it all came together, and I enjoyed having this whilst otherwise working on a range of sketches and other ideas. Now though, that being said, we have come upon time here for this week. I hope you've enjoyed this video and my waffling as usual. I certainly enjoyed making this video, and I am rather glad that I altered my intended upload schedule, just to kind of accommodate for more time for each thing that I'm working on. It certainly helped this drawing at the very least, as I would have otherwise rushed it more than I needed to. Final notice though, this is actually the March print for the print club that I intend to run. By joining, you will receive a sticker and a print each month by post, and the link is below if you want to join. I actually intend for members to be able to vote on themes in the future, so if that interests you, then be sure to check it out. But for now, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful week, and for now, goodbye.